Today we welcome Ralph Ellis back to Esoteric Thoughts. Thank you, Ralph, for joining us again. So today, Ralph, one of the things we'd like to kick off with is Solomon. This is yet another biblical character. And why are they missing from the records?
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? We have this story from history, and all of these famous characters are missing from the historical record. It's a bit repetitive. It happens time and time again. And so we get this very famous monarchy, the United Monarchy, as they call it, David and Solomon, and the Queen of Sheba and all of the other characters associated with the United Monarchy. And they're all missing from the historical record. So how can that be so? You know, we've had archaeologists like Finkelstein and Silberman from Israel, very competent, very well-known archaeologists, and they've studied this era within Judea, Israel, and their considered opinion was that at the time of the United Monarchy, Jerusalem was no more than a village. So there was no United Monarchy. There was no David. There was no Solomon. There is no evidence whatsoever for these particular monarchs. So how can that be? And you come down to pretty much the same as we were talking about before, two separate camps. You get the literalists and the minimalists. And the literalists will say, well, you know, we've got the story in the Bible, so you just believe it. And the minimalists or the mythicists will say, well, look, you know, none of this can be found in the historical record. So it's all mythology. It's all been fabricated. It's just a story. And as usual, I sort of take the median view between the two and say that, well, you know, if this story is not obvious in the historical record, perhaps we're looking in the wrong era or the wrong location. And perhaps if we sort of spread our view outwards a little bit, take in all of the possibilities, perhaps we will find this famous United Monarchy of Israel. And that's what I did. So I looked around, and it seems so obvious to me that I don't know why nobody else has seen this before. It just seems so obvious who these people really were. And the first question you've got to ask yourself is, well, we're going to look at this in another talk when we talk about the Exodus, but there are great links between the Israelites and Egypt because that's where they came from. So if we look back into Egypt, is that going to help us? I mean, even in the first century, Strabo, the Greek historian, talks about Judea. And he says of Judea that it's inhabited by a mixed stock of people from Egyptian and Arabian and Phoenician tribes. But although the inhabitants are mixed up as such, the most prevalent of the accredited reports in regard to the Temple of Jerusalem say the ancestors of the Judeans were Egyptians. Okay, so that's Strabo. He's like 2nd century BC. Again, saying that we should look back into Egypt if we want to find these people. And so I looked in Egypt and couldn't find them. And then I thought, well, instead of looking at names, you know, Solomon, David, why don't we look at their attributes, what they are famous for? And Solomon, of course, is known for his wisdom. And David is known for his star and his city, the Star of David in the City of David. So perhaps if we go back into Egypt and have a quick hunt around, we might find someone who's associated with a star and a city. And we do. In exactly the same era as David would have reigned. So we're talking exactly the same era, just a slightly different location. And the pharaoh I'm thinking about, if you look it up in the reference books, it'll say Susens. but that's a Greek rendering of the original name. His name was Pasibakahayanet, and it means my star rises in my city. And the glyph of this name has the star city and has the star glyph and the city glyph. So here we have a monarch who is identified with the star and the city in exactly the same way as King David is. And well, that's interesting. And it's also interesting that both of these kings ruled from what you might say is the same location. So King David was in Jerusalem, but Jerusalem is called Zion. And Pasibakahayanet ruled from Tanis, but Tanis is called Zoan. So one was the king of Zion, and the other was the king of Zoan. And in the Hebrew, of course, Aramaic is pretty much the same spelling because they don't have vowels. And you might say, well, you know, Pasibakahayanet doesn't sound very much like David. You know, where on earth do you get David from? Well, the star has two pronunciations, two words can mean star for the star glyph. It can either be pronounced as Siba or Sheba, which is a familiar term, of course, from the biblical texts, or it can be pronounced as Duat. And of course, the Aramaic name for King David was King Duat. So you could call this particular king Paduat Kahayanet. And Duat is David. Okay, well, that's interesting. But as usual with my identifications, you know, just a similar name. Okay, we've got two similar attributes and a similar city. We're starting to get some good correlations between these two characters. So I thought, well, you know, might as well look, because, okay, you might identify one person as being very similar to someone in Egypt. But if this is true, if what I'm saying is the United Monarchy was this particular dynasty in Egypt, then everything about this dynasty will have to be the same as the biblical story. All of the ancestors, the court, the people, all of it will have to be the same. You can't just have one person and one name sounding similar in order to make a correlation between these two dynasties. So I looked into it, and I found that they were exactly the same. So if we go back through the ancestors of King David, you get someone called Ezron, which is sort of similar to Ramesses, Ramesses. Okay, that's not terribly illuminating, but the next of the ancestors is called Ram. Ramesses, Ram. And the next ancestor is called Amenemhab. And that aligns, if you compare, you know, the king list of the United Monarchy with the king list of Egypt, the next pharaoh in line is Amenemhab. Amenemhab, Amenemhab. Sounds very similar, doesn't it? And the next ancestor is Nashon, and he aligns with Amenemneshu. Neshon, Neshu, sounds the same. And the next ancestor is Siaman. Sorry, in the biblical text, he's Salmon. And in the historical record, he's called Siaman. Pharaoh Siaman. Salmon, Siaman. And the next one is Boaz, the famous Boaz. And in the historical record, he is Pharaoh Buasorkon. Boaz, Buas. It's the same name. And the next one is Obed. ancestor of King David. And in the historical record, he's Amenem Opet. Obed, Opet. So we've got a whole series of ancestors here of these two dynasties, of the United Monarchy and of the 21st dynasty of Egypt, where you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ancestors have very, very, very similar names, considering, of course, that these names have come down through us through a couple of languages, through Aramaic, Hebrew, and the alternatives we get from the Egyptian spelling. But of course, with the Egyptian spelling, we're not always 100% sure that we've got the pronunciation correct with these Egyptian names and words. So bearing in mind the possible corruptions, we have very, very similar names. And then we come down to David and Solomon. As I said, David is Duat, Pharaoh Paduat Kahayanet. But if this dynasty is the same dynasty, then everyone in the court should have the same name. And while that might seem impossible, it's exactly what we find. So if we look at the daughter of King David, one of the daughters of King David was called Makatamar. And the daughter of this particular pharaoh was called Matkara Mutemhat. Makatamar, Makara Mutemhat. Is that not the same name? I mean, this is a very complex name. We're not talking Sue or, Kim or something very, very simple. We're talking Makatamar Mukara Mutemhat. Is that not the same name? I think it's, and they're both the daughter of this particular king who I've already compared with the star and the city symbolism of King David. So we're talking pretty much the same era. And if we go down, well, we've seen his daughter, but his architect and his general are the same as well. So the architect of King David was Hiram Abi, or Hiram is my father, or Hiram Abif. If you go to the Masonic world, they will call him Hiram Abif, was the chief architect of King David and then King Solomon. And the chief architect of this particular pharaoh was called Hiram Saf or Hiramatif. So Hiram Abif, Hiramatif, sounds like the same architect to me. And we have his general as well. So the famous general from the United Monarchy, if people know the story very well, was Joab. He was the army commander for King David. And of course, the army commander for this particular pharaoh was called Joabinjed. Joab, Joab. It's the same name. And further than that, this is what I like about this research, is it tells us more about the story than we already know. So if you look into the biblical story, it will say of Joab, the army commander, it says, this is from 2 Samuel 18:1. And it says, King David numbered the people and set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over them. And David sent forth a third part of his people under the hand of Joab, a third under Abashi, and a third part under Ittai. So they were the 3 army commanders for King David, were Joab, Abishai, and Ittai. And they were captains of thousands. But if we look into the Egyptian record and we look up the name for Joabinjed, Joab in the ancient Egyptian means 10,000. So not only is the name the same, but the meaning of the name is the same as well, which tells you that actually Joab is not a name. It's a title. That's his, it's like saying a centurion. He's a captain of hundreds. Now, where he was a captain of thousands. So his name was Joab, the captain of thousands, because Joab in Egyptian means 10,000. So it tells you even more about this story than we originally knew. And that to me makes this a true story. If your theory and your research now becomes predictive and it actually explains things that you didn't know before, then I think we can have fairly good confidence that this is correct. But as usual, people will not accept this. So I spoke to Finkelstein, the archaeologist from Israel, about this. And his reply was that, well, just because all of the names are the same doesn't mean this is the same dynasty and the same people. Okay, but it's worthy of research, isn't it? You know, it's maybe we should look closer at this. If all the names are the same, perhaps we could have a look into this and see if it is worth researching further. But the thing is, this explains what has not been explained before. Because before we had this story of this rich, powerful, influential monarchy. Kings came from all over the known world to see Solomon and David. And he's not there in the historical record. So how can this be? If Jerusalem was no more than a village, the story doesn't make sense. But of course, if he was the pharaoh of the 21st dynasty, then this does make sense. Because yes, indeed, people would have traveled from all over that region to see this particular king. And he was powerful, he was rich, he was the richest king in this era. We know that from his sarcophagi. And the interesting thing about this, of course, is that we have their sarcophagi. They're in the Egyptian Museum. So if you go down to the Egyptian Museum and have a look at the Tanis finds, you will see the sarcophagus of King David, which is a solid silver sarcophagus. Very, very expensive, because many people say that silver was more valuable than gold in this era. And you've got this solid silver sarcophagus of King David and his gold death mask. And then you look at the next pharaoh in line. The next pharaoh would have been Shishak, Solomon. And again, as a solid silver sarcophagus and a solid gold death mask, a very realistic one, actually, a very, very well-made death mask, which shows you exactly what King Solomon would have looked like. And then we have the mummy and the sarcophagus of the daughter we were talking about, Makara Mutemhat. We have her sarcophagus as well. So you can see what she sort of looked like as well. And okay, so that's the basic thesis. Now, some people immediately came up and said, well, that's not possible because you're saying that Sheshonk was King Solomon. But in the biblical text, Sheshonk, of course, came up and destroyed Jerusalem. That's a part of the biblical story. And I sort of looked at that and thought, well, yes, this could be a problem, but actually, when you read it, it's not a problem at all. So this comes from Chronicles 2:12. 2:9, 2:12. Anyway, Chronicles 2:12, verses 2 to 9, I think. And basically it says that in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, who was the next king after Solomon, basically, Shishak, which is Sheshonk, the next pharaoh after Pasebekhayanit, was called Sheshonk. Shishak, king of Egypt, came up to Jerusalem with 1,200 chariots and 70,000 horsemen. Whereupon the princes of Israel and the king humbled themselves and said, "The Lord is righteous." So Shishak, the king of Egypt, came up against and attacked Jerusalem and took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. And he carried away the shields of gold which Solomon had made. And you think, well, okay, that proves that Solomon cannot be Shishak. But it doesn't, because it doesn't exactly say that. And this is where some of these translations are a little bit suspect. If you go back into the Aramaic, it doesn't say that Shishak attacked Jerusalem. It just says that he came up to Jerusalem, which is different, you know. And if you go into the Vulgate, which is obviously a Latin text, fairly early, because remember the Vulgate is earlier than any of the extant Aramaic or Hebrew texts that we have. And the Vulgate says that he departed from Jerusalem. So in the Latin, it says, "And in the 5th year of Rehoboam, Shishak, the king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem, and Shishak, the king of Egypt, departed from Jerusalem, taking away the treasures of the king's house." Okay, so how does this fit into my scenario where this king would have been Sheshonq himself? Well, actually, it does fit very well, because after the United Monarchy, after David and Solomon, the monarchy split between the two sons of King Solomon. And, well, one of them might have been not his son, but anyway, let's call them the two sons of Solomon. The kingdom was split between these two sons. And they started a civil war between them. Now, it's assumed that when these kings became king, Solomon must have died. But that's not always true. There are many instances in Egypt where the king was in a co-regency with his sons. And this is what I think happened in this particular case. So Solomon, Shishak, was in a co-regency with his sons, and his sons had started a civil war up in the north. Because remember, Sheshonq at that time was the king of all Israel and Judea. His empire stretched from southern Egypt all the way through to Judea and Israel. So at that particular time, if you asked who is the king of Israel, they would say Sheshonq, because he owned that area. Even if he didn't live there, he lived in the Nile Delta at Zoan, at Tanis. He was still the king of Israel. So you can see where this confusion could have come from. So what happened is that King Solomon Sheshonq was still alive. His sons had started this civil war up in Judea and Israel. So he just marched up to his previous capital, which was Zoan in Tanis, and demanded the treasures of his house, and took them back to where he was living at that time, which was down in Thebes in southern Egypt. And so the story that we get from the Old Testament is pretty much correct. This is probably exactly what happened. And this is all very interesting, because now we have found Solomon and David in the historical record. So again, this ancient text that we've got out of ancient history, which seems so mythical to so many people, suddenly we can make sense of it. We can put it back into the historical record and say, yeah, these events really happened. the story is true. The actual history that we get from the Old Testament is more or less 100% true. But people won't accept it because it's too radical for them. It changes the story too much. For a theologian, it means that King David and King Solomon were Egyptian polytheists. And that's difficult. They don't want Solomon to be a polytheist. And yet he was. So theologians won't like this story because it will put this story back into Egypt. And it'll equate the United Monarchy of David and Solomon with polytheists in Egypt, pharaohs of Egypt, who were worshipping the Egyptian gods. And of course, that's unacceptable to many people. But if we go back into Kings and Chronicles, the story of the United Monarchy, Solomon did exactly the same. It says in 1 Kings 11:7, then did Solomon build a high place for Chemosh, the abomination or the idol of Moab, and for Molech, the idol of the children of Ammon. So we can see that King Solomon was building temples for these different idols. He was a polytheist. He wasn't a monotheist of pure Judaism. And who is Chemosh and Molech? Well, Chemosh, well, it doesn't explain Chemosh very well in the Old Testament, but Chem or Cam was the original name for Egypt. That's what it was called. So Chemosh, it sounds like the idols of Chemosh. Well, it's the idols of Egypt. And that's exactly what Shishak was doing. He was building temples for the other idols of Egypt. And Molech, people make a lot of noise about Molech, you know, the abomination of various peoples. But Molech just means the king. It's a very simple name. It just means the king in Aramaic. So Molech of the Ammons. So Molech of the Ammons, the king of the Ammons. Well, Ammon was, of course, the great god of Egypt, Amun, Amun-Ra. And so what it's talking about here is the king of the Egyptian gods. Excuse me. So what it was talking about here was the king of the Egyptian gods, Amun-Ra. And so what this is saying in 1 Kings 11:7 is that Solomon was building idols for the gods of Egypt. Now, that's a little surprising if you're following the biblical story and you don't understand the Egyptian connections. But if you understand the Egyptian connection back to the Exodus, which we'll talk about in a later talk, and if you understand the Egyptian connections that the United Monarchy was linked to Egypt via the kings of Tanis, then of course Solomon would have been building idols and temples to the kings of the Egyptians, to Amun-Ra. So it does accord very well with what the biblical story is saying. And conversely, if we look at archaeologists like Finkelstein and Silverman, they can't accept this either because it's political. They are Israelis working for the Israeli government. And therefore, everything has to be in accordance, not only with what the Israeli government wants, but the people who control the Israeli government, many of which are Orthodox Jews. And so you can't have government archaeologists going around saying, sorry, you've built your nation in the wrong place. You know, the whole reason for Israel being there is because this was the ancient capital city of the Israelites. Well, if you put the Israelites back into Tanis, which is in the Nile Delta, then they should have built Israel in the Nile Delta in Egypt. That is highly political. You can't really say that in the modern world, especially if you're working for the Israeli government, especially if one of your great enemies is Egypt next door, who has attacked you on three occasions in the last 60 years. It's a bit of a hot potato. And so no one can accept this, even though it is pretty obvious that the United Monarchy of Israel was the 21st dynasty of Egypt. It was the same dynasty. They are the same people. And so this is a continuation of what I have developed and what we'll talk about in other episodes, that all of Israeli history, all of Judaic history comes out of Egypt. It is the record of an Egyptian dynasty, a particular Egyptian dynasty, an Egyptian dynasty that came out of Mesopotamia and went down into Egypt. We will talk about this later, and became very powerful in Egypt, but were actually kicked out of Egypt. And of course, that story accords very well with the story of the Old Testament. So what we have in the Old Testament is what they used to call the day book of the Pharaoh. And the day book recorded all of the events in the royal court of the pharaohs of Egypt. And this is the day book of these particular pharaohs who mostly inhabited the north of Egypt. So they were from Lower Egypt, from the Nile Delta, down as far as, you know, Cairo, Giza. That was the area that they controlled. And this is their story. And that story has been sort of changed, and a little bit, not very much. It's been changed a little bit. The location has been changed because they did indeed end up in Jerusalem. That's where they ended up. But they didn't end up there until the 6th century BC. So at least 400 years after the events given here in the United Monarchy, they did then end up in Jerusalem. And that's why their story has become located in Jerusalem. But the original Temple of Solomon was built in Tanis, in the Nile Delta. And it has the same name, pretty much. The Temple of Solomon is called the Haikal Yahweh, the Temple of Yahweh. And the temple in Tanis was called the Hetkar Ptah. Haikal, Hetkar, the Temple of Ptah. And that's the temple that they built in Tanis. Same name, just a different god name, that's all. So yeah, that's my story of the United Monarchy. So it's an interesting alteration to the standard story.
Thank you, Ralph.